social media, right? This thing with Facebook and Twitter. And I realized that people didn't have to rely on those gatekeepers anymore. That you could create, like you've done here with this beautiful studio, you could create your own microphone.
Welcome, friends. I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is the Adrian Sinclair Show. And today my guest is Kerry, who's an author and radio host and a whole slew of a bunch of other things in the industry of broadcasting, with a long history of working for big broadcasting companies, and now here in Utah in K-Talk. And we're going to be talking about everything surrounding that space of broadcasting and news and fake news and what is happening. So stay tuned, and we're going to be exploring that. So thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate it, Joe. Thank you for being here.
Adrian, I have to say, I have been in studios all over the country. This is a nice studio you have here. This really is a well-done studio. So
well, thank you. Appreciate it. You'll
have a lot of jealous program directors and everyone else. Really nice. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the compliment. It's a little bit of a legacy of going to New York Film Academy when I was younger. And had more spring in my step, and it kind of translated into, hey, if I'm going to set up a studio and invite guests, I want to make them feel kind of in a cozy environment. Sure. So because this is just a conversation, and also good lighting, so everything kind of looks nice and professional. So that's kind of like the result of that in my past. But let's talk about you. If you were to describe yourself in 3 words, what would that be?
Oh, geez, 3 words.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it in 3 words, but I think that I like to see people succeed. I like to see good ideas discussed. And when I used to work for the bigger media companies, that's the only way your ideas could ever make it to the top, right? If you were an inventor, or you were an author, or even if you were a political philosopher and you had a good idea, the only way to really reach the masses 10, 15 years ago was you had to knock on doors of the big cable companies, Good Morning America, big radio shows, and maybe if you got your lucky break and you got through to the right person at the right time, you could present your idea to the world. But then I noticed that started to change, and social media, right, this thing with Facebook and Twitter, and it started to emerge, and I realized that people didn't have to rely on those gatekeepers anymore. That you could create, like you've done here with this beautiful studio, you could create your own microphone. And over the last 15 years, we have seen tumultuous change, I think in a good way, in the areas of media and broadcast, right? I think it started with probably the music industry, right, with Napster.
Right, Napster, right.
Yeah, and
sharing of files
but it has revolutionized the world, and now you have people broadcasting that might reach 100 people, or it might reach 500,000 people.
Right.
But they don't have to rely on those gatekeepers. And that's brought us some good things, but the gatekeepers also served a role. So we're walking our way through that progress.
That is an interesting perspective, because what's happening is the pendulum, it's like everything almost seems to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you had traditional broadcasting stations which had certain standards. Then social media came in, took a lot of advertising away from those platforms, right? So now traditional media had to compete with social media, and with social media, it's like it was wild west. Now it's kind of the pendulum is swinging the other way. Now you have a little bit more of a censorship, or maybe shaping of what news really are, right? Depending on what the platform wants to kind of shape. And so it's an interesting dynamic. On the one hand, you had these platforms which were like the go-to for news because of journalism standards and certain procedures that were followed in order to produce quality.
Right.
And then all of that got more and more hijacked by social media and by competitiveness. And now suddenly, like, these larger networks needed to do things that they were never imagined to do in the past. And so it's an interesting dynamic. What do you think is going to happen next?
I think your traditional media hurt themselves. And you can give example after example of, I think it was ABC last year, September, October of 2019, President Trump announced, I'm going to pull troops out of northern Syria.
Right.
And for political reasons, there was a group of people saying, this is going to lead to chaos, it's going to lead to millions of deaths and starvation.
Right.
And ABC ran a video clip. And the caption of that video clip was, "Slaughter in Syria." And they showed this clip of just, it was at night, and you could see the gunfire and the machine guns going off. And they were saying this is a direct result of Trump pulling out, and now we have this conflict between the Kurds and the Turkish army.
Mm-hmm.
That was ABC News. They played it on their evening news show, and then they played it on their Good Morning America. It wasn't a media watchdog that called them out. It was a blogger who looked at that video and said, I've seen that before. And it turns out that the video wasn't from the Turkish-Syrian border. It was a gun show in Kentucky.
Oh, my goodness.
And you look at that and you're like, wait a second.
What just happened?
Right. And so that's, like you said, big journalism has standards. They have procedures. You just don't put something on TV. It goes through a submission process.
Right.
Despite all those safeguards, that video clip was played not once but twice.
Right.
ABC then, because if you do the side-by-side, it's clear that this is the gun show from Kentucky.
Right.
Which must have been quite a gun show because it looked like combat.
Yeah.
But ABC, they apologize, and the video's, taken down. But what really got me thinking was, where's the announcement that we're going to review our procedures? We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. That discussion was never had.
Right.
And so I don't look at up-and-coming podcasters or bloggers or media groups as being inferior, because in many ways they're just as serious about fact-checking and getting it right as these big companies. But I think what's different is that there's a lot of people out there that just don't care.
Right. Why do you think that happened with ABC? Do you think it was the lack of that due diligence? Do you think it was because of the pace? Because what's happening with social media is who's going to be the first, right? And I think there's actually a beautiful video clip with Denzel Washington, who's someone is interviewing him, and I don't know if you've seen that clip, but he was talking about exactly that. It's the speed to who's first, who's going to get the first exposure, the most clicks, and all of that, instead of the due diligence and fact checking. And unfortunately, the market forces in this instance kind of are hijacking, shortening these cycles. So things have to be first. Things have to be out there. So to gather these eyeballs, because advertising is connected to that, the clickbaity-ish type of content that's created in order to steer people into watching this and not that, is kind of hijacking this whole model of really having checks and balances in production. And in the end, that person who has the content, it could be a podcaster or someone who actually has been somewhere, shot it on video, and they have the content, may still reign supreme because the story will reign supreme versus all the padding and professionalism of a production in a corporate space.
And you asked, I think, the perfect question, which was, how does something like that happen, right? Because they have all these checks and balances, and I will tell you that at my time, I spent a little time at CNN, some time at Fox News. I never saw a producer or executive producer of a show say, this isn't true, but I'm going to run it anyway.
Right.
I just never saw that. And I never saw this, we're going to rewrite this script to make this point. I think everybody brings their bias and their experience to the table, but I think they try to check it. But I think you hit it, which was this need for speed, right? If we don't come out with this first, someone else will, and then they're going to get all the clicks.
Right.
And then the advertising dollars follow the
that
clicks.
funnel just goes over there.
Right. And it's really that race to get out and come out first that I think has jeopardized some of the journalistic safeguards that typically have been in place.
Where does this go?
You know, unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. We just saw two people, I think, at the New York Times say, look, even the New York Times, which, you know, I think has a certain bias, they left saying it's run by Twitter, right? Like, it's not our editors who's...
Finding a story, investigative journalism. It's basically, what is trending right now? That's what we should write an article, quickly... publish it so that we can get some of that those eyeballs.
And not only that, but they were saying, not only do that story, but from the perspective that's trending in the Twitterverse, and that should really worry everybody, right? Everybody should look at that and say, wait a second, you know, is that really what we've come down to, which is this mob mentality of, well, this is what the most vocal and, you know, the people who are shouting the loudest, this is what they want. Well, let's give the people what they want. I don't think any paper or media company should do that. I think we look at the facts and we report the facts.
Right.
And that's tough.
It is tough because those are businesses.
Yeah.
And how do you compete with a Twitter tweeting person who just has a phone and can just produce that at no cost, 5 seconds of their time, versus a big company that has, you know, the whole business to run?
Well, Adrian, I won't say any names, but I was asked to approach a podcaster, and there was a radio company who wanted to give this podcaster, I think it was, access to, let's say, 12 radio stations across the country, right? If they agree to come on board, we'll get them on these 12 radio stations. 10 years ago, that was a no-brainer, right? You'd look at that and say, I'm leaving my basement, I'm going to broadcast for this radio group. This podcaster turned down that offer. And they turned it down, and he said, Joe, I have more freedom and I can make more money broadcasting from my basement than I could if I took this deal.
Right.
And so we're seeing this de-evolution, right? This devolving between, before it was, let me get my job at a small newspaper, a small radio station, and you work your way up to the top. Now we see top talent leaving your CNNs and your Fox News and saying, I want to go work for The Blaze or the Huffington Post. Because I think it's two things. One, I think it's the autonomy, right? The editorial control over what you really want to say and believe. And I think now you don't have to sacrifice the monetary side of it. And before you did. And I think the money tends to bring discipline, because your sponsor doesn't want to be embarrassed. And if you rush out with a story and it's not accurate or it's biased, that embarrasses your advertiser.
Right.
And so I don't think seeing these ad dollars flow into different podcasts is a bad thing. I tend to see it as a force that brings discipline to the news process.
Right. The interesting thing, the balance in all of that is, are you going to be producing content that you know is going to be appealing to your sponsors? Or are you going to be producing content that you want to be producing because that's what you're interested in and that's what you want to talk about, and then let the market come into you? And I think those are the two kind of sides of how something can be shaped as a show, right? For instance, Joe Rogan, that's one of his things, and I believe that one of his keys to success is because he didn't want to have that corporate thumb on top of his show telling him, like, no, you can't say this, you can't say that. there's going to be a meeting about it where you can and cannot say, and suddenly this conversation that he has with his guests becomes a production of winding road that you have to navigate very carefully. And I think he's been rewarded for that. The fact that he doesn't have that process of like this corporate oversight in a way, but that's up to him to kind of stay within what
Right.
he feels is morally good, or however you want to slice it. So it's an interesting dynamic.
But look at what you're doing. If you brought in a media consultant and said, okay, this is my idea for a podcast, right? And you said, I'm going to sit down with people for an hour and they're not going to be celebrities. What are my chances for success? I guarantee you that all your media specialists would say, Adrian, you've got to take that hour and you've got to give them 10 minutes or maybe 15, right? And then they're going to say, you've got to bring in some heavy hitters, right? You've got to bring in people. So you're aware of that, but yet you're saying, you know what? I'm going to execute the vision that I have in my heart. And I think that's what we're seeing. And you know what? We've seen now that regardless of the format, if people are speaking to other people, they're going to find each other. And that's the power of social media. So I don't think the tail wags the dog. I don't think people say, look, here's the money, but you've got to do these things. Are there some people that are going to sell their souls and go down that road? Absolutely. But I think it's like a lot of artists. If you try to tell someone who's very creative in the art field, well, let's paint it this, they won't do it because they feel like they're selling out.
Right.
And I think you're seeing the same thing in broadcast, which is, no, this is my show. This is what I want to do.
Right.
And I think that...
And I support that because I believe that the market, despite what people think that there is a million podcasts out there, which I think the number is actually around that. There is about 1 million podcasts right now in the directories of like iTunes and all these different directories. But consider this: 1 million, where there's almost 8 billion people. Let's say let's half that. Let's say 4 billion people. That's still a lot of that's a lot of people that can choose whichever content they want. And so I see the problem that I see. So I advise everyone: hey, if you want to have your own podcast, go for it. I think it's a great thing for personal growth, for learning, being open-minded. Especially if you are open-minded and you're willing to listen to different perspectives, which is what I strive at. I want to be open to different perspectives so that I can grow. I want to allow myself that space to gain knowledge and different perspective from subject matter experts such as yourself, who's been in broadcasting for so many years. But and then let that shape how your show is going to be. So almost from a selfish reasons. Now, of course, there's the monetary aspect that everybody has to look at some point, right? Which is why, how are we doing what we're doing and how are we going to make money? And I think the problem that most podcasters will face is, how do I punch through this noise floor of a lot of content out there? And there's different ways that they can do that. And I'm going to be working on one of them to help other podcasters to kind of punch through that floor. But that's what I kind of see. But even with that, I would not discourage anyone from doing their own podcast, because I think there's just so much. Everybody has a valuable story. If just one guest on your show changes somebody's life, I think that's worth it.
100%. And I think you don't have to reach 5 million people a night in order to have an impact. Who was it who said, each one of us should want to, dent the universe, and I like that. And more than any time in our history, each of us can. You want to be a publisher? You don't need a publishing house anymore. Right. You can do that. And it's the same thing with broadcast, that there are so many opportunities. And I think the people who experience the most success are those people who stay true to their vision. And, they might have to tweak it and they might have to adjust it,
right,
but they really enjoy what they're doing and they enjoy the format. And the audience can pick up on that authenticity. So I think we live in the golden age of media right now.
So let's talk about you. The Joe Kerry Show. You mentioned that you worked for CNN, you worked for Fox, The Blaze,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I believe, and anything else that I want to mention? I want to say you did some things with
Glenn Beck.
Glenn Beck. Thank
Yes.
you. Yes. So tell us a little bit more about your background and where are you now?
Yeah, so I, went to law school, graduated law school, was practicing law in Philadelphia, and
In which specialty?
litigation.
Litigation.
So
I'll have you sign a waiver after the show.
I was going to say litigation. Litigation takes a piece of your soul. Like it just, you go to court every day and you're fighting about everything, right? And it's rewarding because I always felt you're helping people, but there's always that tension, right? And that's tough to be in. And one day, just my path crossed with Glenn Beck. We hit it off and became probably America's oldest intern at 40, and started working with Glenn in a volunteer intern capacity, and eventually his chief of staff, and for about 8 years. And that was my exposure to media for the first time. And there was a lot there that you just, wow, like there's a lot of surprises in that universe. But it was a great opportunity to see, because that was that transition period between your traditional media and the rise of the social, the podcasting, and radio and TV. Everybody was trying to adjust to
the new reality.
It was the Kodak moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all of a sudden,
right,
it's digital. Kodak didn't navigate that transition very well. And you saw the same thing in TV and radio.
Yeah.
And some people got it, and they made the right bets. Some people didn't. But it was a fascinating time to be in that field and see that.
What were some of your most memorable things in kind of growing through that career of broadcasting, where you've seen sort of like the man behind the curtain, and then being a radio host and being an attorney, you are trained in speaking, and you're trained in that art form, because it is an art form. So it suited you well. But there was still growth in terms of how things are done, just on in a broadcasting environment. So what were some of your memorable things that you can share?
I mean, I have to tell you, there's something about, being part of a show or program that millions of people are watching, or writing a book that millions of people purchase, because you feel like, you've left your fingerprints on someone's life. Like you've helped someone, you've clarified an issue, or they're watching the program, and whether it's for validation or information,
right,
they're watching, and that's a rewarding feeling.
Good.
Yeah, it really is. But I think a lot of us have had this experience. I saw a lot of politicians and celebrities coming through the buildings, and there was only one I really ever wanted to meet, and not even an A-list celebrity.
Right. Who was that?
I don't want to say because it's not a good ending, but finally it's announced, she's going to be on studio. She's going to be on set. And I was like, oh, this, I've always wanted to meet her. And she was so rude to our team and our staff and even her own entourage. I had a book that I wanted her to sign. I never pulled it out of the bag. Like, I was just like, she's not that person. And I think, the number one question I was always asked about Glenn was, is he the same person off camera as he is on camera? And no matter what city I went to, whether I was talking to business people or just a collection of fans, the number one question was, is he the same person?
Is he?
Absolutely. I mean, just as nice and as authentic. And I think, they say the camera doesn't lie, and I think that's what they mean. Like, people can perceive that, and just authentic.
Yeah.
And
I like that you said that, because one of the reasons why I'm doing this show...
Adrian was yelling at me, by the way, before the show, and now he's acting... No,
not true.
I'm kidding.
Not true. Absolutely not true. There's something to be said about body language, and even though these podcasts are long form and most people will be probably listening to them, when I listen to podcasts that are lengthy, that when there's some kind of conversation where I need to sort of like verify, I need to look at the person who's speaking to kind of assess their how genuine they are. What is their body telling me? I think that's a key component and a benefit of doing a video podcast. I mean, still for listening purposes,
right.
audio option is critical for those who consume especially lengthier content, while they're working out or doing chores, what have you, driving, commuting. But having the option of having that video to go along so that you can take a look at that person and really assess how genuine, how real they are, I think is a key thing that really changes the game in forming and shaping opinions of people, of the audience, of looking at you. And the second thing I believe that's critical is like providing that kind of environment where those who are your guests can open up, can see that the host is just genuinely just interested in what they have to say, and hopefully not have the pressure of sensationalizing what the conversation is going to be about, or submarining the guest to pull out some piece of, like, cornering them so they can get that little tidbit that's going to be hot on the internet for 30 seconds and gets a million views and clicks and things like that. I think those are kind of the critical components that podcasters should be really focusing on to really build out an audience that's going to be loyal, in the sense of they will know what to expect from that kind of interaction, from that show, from that space.
No, and that's a great point. And I think, and one thing I didn't know before my media experience was that all those media appearances that you see from celebrities, or less so with politicians, but it's all negotiated in advance. What questions you get to ask, how many of those questions you get to ask. And I think you're right, because then it comes across as very stilted. And even though it's not rehearsed,
right,
the guest knows it's coming.
Yeah.
The host knows it's coming, and it changes the dynamic.
It does.
And I really think you're right that we have, especially with mainstream media, they call it gotcha journalism. And instead of having this honest exchange, it's like, let me figure out the best way to get this point across, or like to catch them in an inconsistency or a lie, or I think that does everybody a disservice. I think the best thing to do is tell me your ideas.
Yeah.
And I think you're the facilitator, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're the host, and I think a great host is just, they're not there to make a point. They're there to hear a story. They're there to get information. And when everybody has their guard up, I think that's an impediment, a big impediment,
yeah,
to that transaction.
I absolutely agree. And this is 80-something episode that we've done this year, that we just started like 6 months ago, and 6-7 months ago. And every time when I speak with an interesting guest, it's that moment that I see, not with you because you're a professional, so you already were in that mode, but, and we kind of chatted before we started recording, that moment where they, hi, my name is so-and-so, here's my facade, here's the veneer that I want to project, and then they say, right, like, oh wow, this is just a conversation, we're just talking? Oh, you mean like you're not gonna, like, you don't have a pitchfork over here to, like, right, spear me with? Mm-hmm. And then it's like that exhale happens, and they're like, wow, okay, different mode. And then that's when that person really comes out. And those are beautiful moments because you feel like, okay, from this point on, it's gonna be a great conversation, and it's gonna take us in interesting directions, and that storytelling is gonna come out, and there's gonna be value to be had from that conversation, because the guest is not guarding themselves in like, right, oh, maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe I should this, like, okay. And it's just a whole different experience.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's what makes, I think that's Oprah Winfrey. Your exceptional interviewers, right, are just people that I think they care about the story and they care about the truth. And they may have a bias or an agenda, but they don't let it influence their work.
Right.
And I think that's why we look at these interviews and say, wow, that was really amazing. And I think that's one of the dangers we're seeing now with, I don't know if you saw this clip, Adrian, it was the fake news on Apollo 11. Did you see that?
No, tell me about it.
So, you know, the deep fake, which are these videos that they show someone speaking, it's their voice, it's their face, but they never said those words.
Right.
And so there's an AI company that did a deep fake video of Richard Nixon and him making the announcement that, you know, we all know the Apollo 11 landed, they got to the moon. They did a deep fake showing Richard Nixon making the announcement that, hey, I'm saddened to announce that the Apollo 11 didn't make it back. And you're watching this video and you're thinking, if you saw this video with no context, you would believe
Oh, yeah.
Richard Nixon made this announcement that we never made it to the moon. And I think those are things that are going to, we won't know the truth.
Right.
And I think we need multiple touch points to say, one, it starts with us being grounded, right? We need to know each other. And I think as a society, we don't. And I think we increasingly turn to social media or the opinions of others to say, who is this person? The best defense against deep fakes and fake news is to get to know people, because then we're like, that doesn't
That's
sound
out of
like
character, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, as a society, we're retreating in that area, which forces us to rely more on these other narratives. But we are at the very beginning of a time where you'll be able to watch a video and say, I saw that with my own eyes. I know what happened. And the reality is,
It was just manufactured.
yeah. And
Fabricated stuff, fake news right now, not really knowing what is real, what is not real. I wanted to, so thank you for mentioning that, because I did want to talk about that, because we're talking about trends, right? We were talking about the sort of classical broadcasting sort of space, and then social media, how it's changing for good or bad, and it seems to be double-edged sword. Now you kind of fold into this conversation deep fakes, fabricated content, especially when you make it extra spicy, where it just, you
Sure.
can't almost resist forming a biased opinion without, it basically just hijacks your cognitive function, where you see someone do something that's totally fabricated and it's like, no, I saw it with my own eyes. Where do we go with this? I mean, where, like you mentioned, that it's going to be the multiple touch points that will hopefully help shape a person, like an opinion or a profile maybe about a person, that then someone would say, like, you know what, this is like so out of character. Not that that person wouldn't be able to do that. You know, if you would have a video of Richard Nixon kicking a puppy or something like that, right? You'd be like, okay, is that real or is that fabricated? But it makes you it makes me feel that the future is going to be very scary in that respect, because it's going to be a tug of war of those fabricated videos kind of trying to shape public opinion. And we've seen voting impacted by, elections impacted by these types of technologies, reshaping of forming a public opinion. And the future is just going to get easier and easier in terms of fabricating those.
Absolutely.
Everybody's going to be able to do that in their bedroom, toying around with this. So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I know the way we handle it in the courtroom is, you know, you get to cross-examine witnesses, you get to call your own witnesses, and you bring in evidence. We can't do that.
Can't do that. It's
right?
not scalable.
Yeah, that's not going to work. So it really comes down to it. And this is let me start with my fear. My fear is that what happens is that this is used as a way to further restrict this new media, right? That, well, we need to be here, you know, to fact check, right? That's the new one. Well, we're going to fact check everything. I don't believe in that. I believe, we have this open space, and it should be a battlefield of ideas. And just like any battlefield, people are going to use spies and subterfuge and dirty tricks to get an advantage. But I think at the end of the day, the more ideas that enter that space, the better. Because as they fight each other in this very public forum, and it's ugly and it's divisive, but what's the solution? Is the solution to say we're going to empower these other players to decide whose ideas make it onto that field? I think that's more dangerous.
So censorship, informing, and then shaping of what's actually even viewable by the user, by the viewer, by corporations that may be driven by profit motive or risk management, because we have to fold that in as well.
Right.
Companies like Facebook or Google, YouTube, which now or should be maybe even considered as utilities, because people are watching, consuming so much information
right.
through those, that they really should have some responsibility. So now they if that knee-jerk reaction goes too far, they're going to be like, nope. I don't want to show this even mildly controversial content, right. because that may get me in trouble with it being legal or lawsuits and things like that. So it's very, very scary place to be at. And I kind of feel for them too, in a way. The profit motive, not so much, because when I see videos that are 50 million views of something that's just it's just clickbait-ish, right. just for the purpose of making money, I don't see as much utility in that. But then at the same point, I kind of feel for them, because to police all of this in terms of trying to be, as a company, not responsible for someone releasing something and them kind of like, well, you guys didn't do anything about it, therefore you're liable and I'm going to sue you.
Right.
So it's
Yeah, and I think in legal parlance, it's right, the publisher versus platform. And if you are a platform, you have legal immunity under federal law. You're like the phone company.
Right.
They don't get in trouble if someone's making illegal drug trade on the phone.
Right.
But what we're seeing now is these platforms like Twitter or YouTube or Facebook, as soon as they enter the space of editorial control, and they're saying this is acceptable, this isn't, I think they're leaving the protections of the platform, and now they're entering you're a publisher.
Oh.
And when you're a publisher, you then can be liable, right? You can then be held responsible. So as they insert themselves into this decision-making position, they're leaving the protections of the platform. And that's the big debate now, which is, should they be liable for, because it's clear, you can't pick and choose which side you want to regulate or police. So I know that I think it's this week or next week, Congress is doing they're bringing in, Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
Right.
And
CEOs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But this is the new town square, right? I mean, this is the new place that people go to exchange ideas. And people always say, well, Joe, the First Amendment only applies to government. Facebook has no duty to allow any speech it disagrees with. That's true, and it's protected under that platform protection of the law. But again, as soon as they start to regulate that speech, I think it was in the 70s, the Supreme Court held that shopping malls, even though it's a private place, they had become the new town square, that's where people went to
hang out and just spend their time.
Right, and so the court actually imposed certain restrictions on the speech they could limit, meaning if you didn't let anybody in the mall, you're good. But as soon as you start to decide which politicians or which groups, well, then you may have a duty to let other people in. And I think it's under that type of theory that people are arguing Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have a similar duty or a similar responsibility.
You're like the perfect guest for this to shed that perspective, because you are an attorney and in litigation and you're in media and broadcasting and you're a talk show host. So you have all these components that are critical in kind of understanding all the moving parts in this, because it is a complex problem. On the one hand, you're like suppressing the freedom of speech. On the other hand, it's just Wild West and anything goes. Right. And then, well, what do we do with that? Where's that happy medium?
Well, I think the medium is this. I think that allowing people to express their ideas does two things. One, a lot of people expressing their ideas think and say, wow, that doesn't sound as rock solid as I thought it did. And I think that type of introspection, I think, is a good thing. You know, in talk radio, the reason I love talk radio is it's always two-way, right? You're getting calls coming into the show. And right now, the big issue with, churches being shut down and do I wear a mask, don't I wear a mask? People feel very passionately about those issues.
Right.
And they'll call up and they'll express themselves very passionately. The next caller might feel with the same amount of passion and zeal the exact opposite. That's a good thing, to have that juxtaposition of those two ideas. And my hope is always caller A heard what caller B said and caller B heard what caller A said. But I do know that the audience is being exposed to both ideas. And to me, that's healthy and that's good. And again, there's a reason that the free speech was in the First Amendment. And it truly is the foundation for everything else. And when we're told you can't talk about this or we're afraid, right? This new poll that came out, 62% of Americans are afraid to share their opinions on certain topics in public. That should give everybody pause. And that same poll showed, we don't talk about it as much, but that same poll showed that, especially among individuals, I think 34 and younger, there's an increasing number of people in that age group who believe you should be able to be fired from your job if you make a donation to Trump or Biden. That's really, in my opinion, dangerous territory because we're defining people by whether or not they're going to donate money to a candidate. I don't think that takes us to a good place. I'd rather just let's have this discussion. It's getting harder and harder to do.
Did that poll mention why? What was the reasoning behind 62% or 68% of Americans not willing to opine on things, express their opinions on things? Is it the cancel society that we're in? Is that the repercussions of it or anything else?
I think absolutely. I mean, and we're seeing it, right? It's not just you say something today. It's you tweeted something 5 years
right.
ago and you're out of a job. And people are...
The internet never forgets.
Right. And people are rightfully, I would say, concerned. They're petrified. They're petrified that, because which one of us could withstand the scrutiny of, have you ever offended anyone? Have you ever said anything that could have offended anyone?
Right.
When that's the standard, yeah, we all better be looking over our shoulders because I don't think anyone can survive that kind of scrutiny.
Right.
And so people just decide, you know what, it's better for me not to say anything. It's better for me not to be engaged or to hide their activity. Right. And we see that with these polling results we saw it in 2016. Right? Up until the day of the election,
right,
no one really truly understood the strength of Donald Trump's support. And it's because they were intentionally not telling pollsters who they were going to vote for. That's, again, I think that's an indication of something that has to be addressed because it's indicative of an underlying condition.
What are the repercussions, do you think, of that pulling back of our society, that you will not express your opinion publicly because of these repercussions that may come now or any time in the future? This is a risk management sort of place that we're getting into where you're like, well, I won't say anything publicly because, again, that can be held or twisted or used however in the future, because this is not, this is going to have some repercussions. What do you think that's, society, as a society? If everything's going to be overly PR, politically, PC, politically correct, then where do we go with this? When people will be just essentially silent and...
Well, let me give you a very bad answer to that. Have you ever seen World War Z?
Yeah.
Okay. He flies to Israel, and he's trying to find out, how did the Israelis know that this was coming, right? Because they prepared in advance for it.
Right.
And he has a discussion with one of their leading generals, and the leading general says, well, it's because we meet, and my job is to offer the countervailing position. So if everybody at that table says, there's no such thing as zombies, there can't be zombies.
Yeah, people, we're talking about zombies over here, by the way. World
Yes.
War Z.
I told you it was a bad analogy.
Yeah, it's good.
But he comes out and he says, it's
point.
my job to take that opposite position and present it. Not just present it, but advocate for it. And we lose that, right? We lose that if we're in a society where we're afraid to share or express ourselves. And it starts at a very young age, right? Like, your kids learn pretty quickly, what you can say, what you can't say. I would rather see an environment where, look, and there's some things you shouldn't do. I remember my daughter came home and she had written, I think it was, 50 lines on this page and 50 lines on the reverse page. I will not give the middle finger to my classmates. Because apparently she had done that, and her punishment was write 50 times on each side. And then they made her draw a picture of her with her middle finger up, which I still to this day don't understand why they made her do that.
At least it was not cut off.
Yes, right. That's true. That's true. But it's like, I get it. There's some things that we have to correct and address, but again, I think when we empower people to censor, we lose a lot more than we gain. And I think that's the real danger and the real threat. And look, there's people who call me up all the time on radio, and I'll tell them, look, I disagree with what you're saying. I don't see this the same way you do. But I would never think to say, you can't come on the air and express that. Because I want that discussion to take place with the audience. Because my hope is that people are benefited that way. Not that I'm convincing somebody, but that they look at it and say, okay, I can see why he's saying that.
Yeah. I'm going to give, you had World War Z.
Yes.
I'm going to bring a jester in the court, in a king's court analogy. A very important function of having a jester side of the king who could bring those things that no one else would, none of the advisors, none of the people around the king would dare to say, to provide that opinion, because they could lose their head. And there was that very special function of that court jester that served the king within limits, of course, I'm sure. But if it was done properly, that court jester could bring in something that no one else could, that opposing view, that different perspective, not even maybe opposing view, but a different perspective that nobody else wanted to contribute, even though they may have thought about it. And I think that's the analogy in my head. When we're losing that plane of discourse where we can discuss these topics because they are invalid by even mentioning whatever is not popular, and you get canceled because you even raised raised that topic as a point of discussion. I think that's a very, very dangerous territory, and I hope that this pendulum that's swinging in that direction of that happening, of the cancel culture, is going to bounce, and we're going to have that golden moment again of that equilibrium between these extremes again. So, and I hope it has to, I think it has to run its course where people will basically say, like, well, this is not manageable, this is not just, we don't want to live like that, because where does it end? If you extrapolate from this and just lead to its logical conclusion, no one's going to talk at all. They'll be like, hello. Right.
And I think that's why, when we change the Constitution, right, when we ratify a new amendment, we leave the old amendments in there, right? 19 doesn't, the Prohibition Amendment doesn't disappear because we've repealed it. It's still there on the books. I think those are the things that are good because it prompts this discussion, right? You're like, well, let's talk about why did it happen and what were the consequences? Why did we repeal it?
Right.
And this notion that we can forget, we can move on, again, I think the discourse is absolutely essential. And now the irony, Adrian, is that in an era where there's so many avenues to have this discourse, 62% of the people are afraid to have it honestly.
Yeah.
That's really a waste, because now we have a way to communicate, multitude of ways, but we're afraid to really open up. We're afraid to really share things, and we limit ourselves. We stifle ourselves, and we stifle other people because of that same hesitancy to really open up and say, this is what I think, this is what I believe, because you don't know what's going to come your way.
And you as a radio host, being in that capacity of providing this plane of discussion, what does it take to be a good radio host, or just host in general, for whether you are a podcaster, a video podcaster, a TV personality? In your opinion, and based on your experience, what are some of the attributes that you think of, even yourself? Hey, these are the right things for a radio host or a host to kind of adhere to be good.
I think the number one thing is you just have to be authentic, and I think you have to believe in what you say. And even if it's not popular, I think your audience can perceive when you're not being candid with them. When you're saying things like you said, when you're showing the kitten video because it's clickbait.
Right.
Hosts can do the same thing, but I think those hosts are short-lived. I think those hosts who say, this is what I believe, and I'm willing to explain this to my audience. Some may agree, some may disagree. You develop that rapport with your audience where they respect you, and they may not agree with you, but they'll come back the next day because they know that what you're sharing with them is the truth as you understand it and as you see it. And the other thing I think is, if you don't know something, it's okay to say, I'm not sure. Let me get back to you on that. Or I really don't know enough about that.
Right.
And I think today, we all feel compelled to be an expert in every subject. And again, I think that's unhealthy. And I think it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. I didn't look into that. But anyone out there that wants to get into media, I believe each one of us has a sensor, like a built-in sensor that just says, I like this. I think what I'm hearing is true. And I think this person sincerely cares. And that translates, whether it's over radio or video or in the written word. And it all starts with you having to know yourself, right? You've got to know who you are and what you believe. And once you've molded that part, then I think you can go out and start sharing that message, because you understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish.
Let's step into predicting the future a little bit.
Okay.
From your perspective, your vantage point, where do you think this environment of news and social media and giving possibility for everyone to have their own show goes from here? Do you think that things will shake out at some point, that those who will not persist in building their shows will basically just go away? So it might be like this spike of a lot of content and it's going to kind of dissipate a little bit. Do you think that there's going to be some kind of a hybrid that emerges in the future? What do you think is going to be happening in the future in terms of media, from like the broadcasting aspect to like the social media to whatever else you think it may emerge in the future?
I think that there's going to be a proliferation of platforms, and we see it now. I think Parler is, one that's up and coming for people on the right. You have TikTok, which is, the fastest growing app, I think, in the history of the App Store, just overnight. And I think that's a good thing, right? I mean, Facebook buys Instagram because it can't compete in the Instagram space. Right. Instagram, I think next month is launching Reel because it needs to compete against TikTok. And I think that type of competition is healthy. I think it's good. And what I love about it is, the people who have built up their microphone or their voice on Instagram, all of a sudden TikTok pops up and there's this new army of influencers, right? Just people with different ideas and different notions of what should be discussed. I think that's good. But the proliferation of these platforms is tremendous opportunity for people with a vision to really capitalize on it and say, I don't need to wait in line to host the local TV show or the local radio show.
Right.
So we do a live radio show every day in Salt Lake. Our listenership is far larger on the podcast platform than it is on the radio platform. And again, that's a good thing because people can have access to it. They don't need to be listening in their cars from, noon to 1 and tune it in. They can listen at their convenience. So I think, look, the empire will strike back, right? And we see it now. They've monopolized the news. They want to continue to control those access points. But I think in large part, that ship has sailed. And I think people who really put in the time, and it takes time to do the research and create an atmosphere like you've done here, where it's just you feel good, it looks good. I think, I continue to see the decline of traditional broadcast media, and I think these outlets, including yours, it's going to supplant that. It's just going to, what do they say, nature abhors a vacuum. And as those models decline, I think these other voices have a tremendous opportunity to step into that void.
And let people decide. Let the audience decide with what they subscribe to, with what they support, whether it's by donations or Patreon or funding sending to that. Let them vote with that. That way they have direct sort of impact in supporting whose voice they want to hear. So let the market kind of decide. Mm-hmm. Absent the biases that can be provided by these huge corporations that can put a thumb on things and kind of steer and bias them. So hopefully that's going to get resolved. And it will, I believe, in one way where the other things will find an equilibrium in a long term. So hopefully this pendulum is swinging from left to right and will settle somewhere in the middle and at some point.
It usually does, right? It usually comes back to the middle. Never quite back to the same center,
right? But
it gets back into the general area.
Sweet spot.
Yeah.
So I would love to talk to you more. I have dozens of other questions, and I would like to invite you back to the show to explore some of these topics. And thank you for being on the show. This is your time to give a shout out and maybe some call to action if you'd like. And where can people find out more information about you?
I'd like to give a shout out to a JCW Burger. I noticed that they put extra ketchup on their burger today right before the podcast. So thank you for that. But no, I want to thank Adrian. I think what he's doing and providing this longer format, again, you bring in the media experts, they're going to say this isn't the way to do it. But when everybody's headed this way and you're headed this way, it means one of two things. You're an idiot or you're a genius. And Adrian, I've got to say, thank you for having me here. I think what you're doing is a service. And if you want to learn more, you can just go to littlecloudmedia.com and happy to take your calls or questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you for being here on the show, sharing your very, very interesting perspective. One of my favorite shows by far, just by this conversation and where it's going. I think it's very timely. Love to have you again on the show and discuss some other aspects of this domain, where we're going, especially now ahead of elections in 2020. We haven't even talked about COVID and how that kind of is reshaping things. So definitely want to have you back on the show. And thank you for sharing all your knowledge. And I'm looking forward to having you on the show. And for you viewers, I hope you made it till this far and that you've gained some knowledge and value out of this very interesting conversation with Joe. Check out his. We're going to put in the show notes all the links to his show and to the website where you can find out more about what he's doing, what he's done, and what he's going to be doing. And if you like what we've done over here, please share it within your circle of influence on social media. That's how we're going to grow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our mailing list so we can send you, not spam you, send you our newsletter, our weekly newsletter that we're putting together right now, where you're going to get a sort of a Reader's Digest of previous podcasts from previous week, so you can quickly kind of catch up to see if you missed anything that's interesting to you. And we're going to continue to bring in interesting guests who will be sharing interesting thoughts and experiences to your benefit. So thank you for watching, and until next time, I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is The Adrian Sinclair Show.
Thanks for listening to a podcast with interesting people. Please subscribe and leave a review or comment.
And support us by sharing our episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. And for more information, visit us at apodcast.com. Thanks.